Good evening, good afternoon. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. If you can hear me, please give a thumbs up. Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. I can't hear you, so I want to make sure we can hear each other. So wonderful. So first of all, thank you and welcome to our webinar from Honest Reporting Canada. A lot of people still joining, so we're very happy to have a great crowd. This evening's webinar, An Insider View of Canada-Israel Relations, is a truly special evening. We're going to be welcoming our moderator, of course, journalist Terry Glavin, and he's going to be introducing our two very distinguished panelists, John Baird and Jacques Saada, and I will leave Mr. Glavin to do that. Before we begin, allow me to briefly introduce Mr. Glavin, and then I'll allow him to kick off. So Terry Glavin has worked as a reporter and columnist and editor for a variety of newspapers. His assignments in recent years have taken him to Afghanistan, Israel, the Russian Far East, the Eastern Himalayas, China, and Central America. He's the author of 7 books and the co-author of 3 more. His books have been published in Canada, Germany, the US, and Britain. He's won more than a dozen literary and journalism awards, including the Hubert Evans Prize and several national magazine awards, and he was a recipient of the 2009 BC Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence. His most recent book is the just published Come from the Shadows, A Long and Lonely Struggle for Peace in Afghanistan. So welcome, and we're very happy to have you. So just a note for our panelists. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Glavin, and then I'm going to unmute our panelists as well. Everyone else, you will not be able to unmute yourself for security reasons. But if you'd like to pop in with a comment or a question, you can do so with a comment or a chat bar rather on the right. Send it to me, and I will send it to Mr. Glavin, and we will go from there. Without further ado, Mr. Glavin.
Hello, everybody. I can't see the panelists.
They are there. Mr. Saada is there, and I'm just going to unmute Mr. Baird right now.
Okay, very, very good.
I'm
well,
here.
They are distinguished panelists, and they don't require much introduction. Nevertheless, the Honourable Jacques Saada is a former Liberal cabinet minister, minister responsible for democratic reform, government house leader in the, I guess, the Paul Martin government, and the minister for economic development agency for Canada and for the regions of Quebec, and the minister responsible for La Francophonie. And John Baird is well known to us. He was began, I guess, in Ontario with the Mike Harris government in their governments, and then was elected to Parliament, served a very high-profile role as the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2011 to 2015, and I think it's fair to say kind of carved out a reputation for himself as being a very vocal supporter of Israel. Now, there's a number of sort of immediate questions that I would very much like Jacques and John to address themselves to. There's 3 or 4 that are kind of immediate and pressing, and then I'd like to get into a more sort of bedrock and some of the more fundamental issues that relate to Canada-Israel relations, foreign policy specifically with respect to Israel and the greater Middle East, the Levant and the Maghreb, and also whatever sort of distinctions might be drawn over time in the evolution and development of Canadian foreign policy with respect to Israel, and the evolution and development, the trajectory that both political parties have taken over the years. So why don't we begin now? I think there actually is a distinction to be drawn in the general Liberal Party view and the emerging conservative leadership view about the annexation of parts of Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley, pretty significant stretches of the West Bank. So why don't we begin with Jacques? I dare you.
No problem. Thank you very much. And first of all,
allow me to thank very much Honest Reporting Canada for their invitation. I'm very pleased to attend. And mes meilleures salutations à mon ami John Baird. We haven't seen each other for a long while. I'm happy to see you, John. The issue of annexation would not have been a topic to discuss today if the Palestinians had seized at least one of the so many opportunities to negotiate and achieve peace. So that being said, I know some of the proponents of annexation have some interesting arguments. Application of Israeli law and so on, implementation of Oslo. But at the end of the day, the arguments that I personally have against annexation are much outweigh very, very broadly the advantages of annexation. By the way, let's mention that annexation is ranking very far behind in terms of Israelis' priorities at the present time. In a poll conducted last June, I believe, you had 60% of Israelis in favor of in expressing support or expressing priority in economics, or in the economy, I should say. 20% worried about COVID, and only 4% considering annexation as a priority. Now, at the present time, Israel lives in relative stability and security. The government of the day is a coalition government, which is fragile. Any initiative on annexation would make it even more fragile. And the last thing Israel needs, in my opinion, is another election yet. The plan is very poorly designed. IDF has not been made aware of what the map was actually. 300 leaders, including people from the Shin Bet, from the Mossad and from the IDF, have deplored being put in the dark with this issue. Absorption of Arab populations to a number we don't know at the present time, because we don't know what the limits would be, is a first step into playing the game of the Palestinians in terms of having a certain number of Palestinian people being included in the so-called right of return. And that poses problems in terms of Israeli democracy, in terms of the way that this population will have in the expression of the vote and voting members of the Knesset. At the present time also, there is relative stability with Jordan. Of course, if there is such an annexation, it creates a movement, a shockwave in some countries, including some countries with which Israel has good and solid ties, whether we talk about Jordan, whether we talk about Saudi Arabia, and a number of other countries. So I think all around, the disadvantages of annexation far outweigh any potential advantage. And I would like to hear John about this, because I'm sure he has a few more things to say.
So would I. That was a very fulsome and thorough explication of the issue. Thanks, Jacques. What about you, John?
Well, let me first thank Honest Reporting Canada. They do a great job at holding the media's feet to the fire on anti-Israel bias. And frankly, we need more of Honest Reporting Canada. And frankly, we need more of Honest Reporting Canada, not just dealing with the Israeli issue, but with general issues that the media need to have a watchdog. And I also want to thank you, Terry, for hosting this, and to my friend Jacques. Pleasure with you. I'm also a former government house leader, as Jacques was, in a minority parliament, which is always tough. I will say this: I'm not going to pronounce on the whole issue of annexation or absorption or putting Israeli law in Judea and parts of Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley. The Israeli government hasn't pronounced yet, and I'm not going to get ahead of the government. I don't want to be more Catholic than the Pope, though I've been accused of that in the past. Let me just make a number of points. One is, of course, it's not annexation. Whether you agree or disagree, it's not annexation because it wasn't a sovereign country before 67. So it would be a mistake to call it annexation. And two, let me say this, is I think Zionism, which I'm very passionate about, I think there's two tenets of Zionism. Obviously, you have a Jewish state, but there's two tenets in it. One is that it would be a Jewish state, and two, there would be a liberal democracy. And so that presents some real challenges. There's not a significant population in the Jordan Valley, So it's perhaps that needs to be taken into the equation when people consider their position on the issue. I will say this: I do think the Palestinians and the PLO have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I have seen successive Israeli governments prepared to make painful decisions to achieve peace. You look at Ariel Sharon's painful decision to withdraw from Gaza and evict 9,000 Israelis from the Gaza Strip. That was a painful thing to do, not just to that population, but politically it was very, very tough. And I think we need to see a Palestinian side that will be willing to take equally bold measures for peace, recognizing that neither side in a peace negotiation will get what they want. They will have to make compromises. And I think we've seen the Palestinians have been incredibly effective. They never concede a single point, and Israel has made a number of concessions over the years. And the minute they made a concession, that is just banked and counted as fact. So we'll see where this goes. The Israeli cabinet has not pronounced on it yet. I have one big concern is that the détente going on between Israel and the Sunni Arab world is an extraordinary accomplishment of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The increasing détente in sub-Saharan Africa, the increasing détente in Central Asia is an incredible accomplishment for the state of Israel, and I wouldn't want to see that affected by any domestic decisions made in Jerusalem.
Okay, yeah. So you're suggesting that if any sort of annexation, call it what we will, would go ahead, a very significant worry would be that the improved relations between the kingdoms, the various Saudi states, and diplomatic rapprochement and détente, as you called it, elsewhere, might be put in jeopardy.
That's a huge concern. I think that's a huge the invitation that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to visit Sultan Qaboos in Oman before his passing, the significant efforts we've seen in the United Arab Emirates, even hosting Israeli cabinet ministers, the warming relations with Egypt. I just don't want to say, the Bahrain, it's been incredible. That's such huge progress. Right. And I think has the potential to be, the peace treaty with Egypt is a huge strategic asset to Israel. And I think the warming relations have the potential to be significant.
I think also in terms of the timing of all that, if I may, just one more word.
Sure.
It is clear that one of the raison d'etre of this initiative, and I fully agree. The question included the word annexation, so I used it also, but we're talking about sovereignty over some territory. But one of the points made by a number of people, including in the US, was that it would demonstrate to the Palestinians that the Israelis are serious and want to negotiate. The timing is awful in this regard. And the timing is awful for one very simple reason. I'm not even talking about internal reasons to Israel. Who do you negotiate with? We have a country split in two, and discussing independence of this country at this time would amount to negotiating the independence of Pakistan into East and West Pakistan, which was a no-go from the outset. Two countries appearing to be one is not possible. The second thing is there is no leadership which is credible and strong enough to negotiate with at this time. Mahmoud Abbas is on his last weeks, maybe, in terms of political survival. He is challenged from all sources in terms of also corruption and so on. He is not in a position to make any compromise or decision that would be credible and that that Israel can trust. So, what is the use of this issue? I heard an argument which was quite interesting. In some of these areas under consideration for this sovereignty of Israel, You have three legal systems overlapping one another. You have the military, Israeli military law. You have the Jordanian law, and you even have some elements of Ottoman law. So obviously, if there was a way to arrange that, that would make life easier for everybody there. But this is not an argument which is solid enough to justify such a huge movement and a destabilization of the entire area on grounds of negotiating with people that do not have any leader to negotiate with in the first place at this time.
Okay, picking up.
I had a great relationship. If I could, 1 second. I agree with much of what Jacques has said. I actually had a pretty good relationship with President Abbas. I do think his maneuverability to make peace with Israel and to make compromises severely hampered by elements within the Palestinian community and factions of it. I think we had Tony Blair had a great led a great effort by the quartet, and he was a great friend of the peace process and a great friend of Israel. I think we almost need a new quartet, perhaps Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to be able to work with Israel and the Palestinians on peace and help President Abbas or a future Palestinian leader going forward to be able to have the cover to make peace, because he will need significant Sunni Arab support to do so, in my opinion.
Okay, sort of taking off from that idea of sort of unintended consequences or the implications of these kinds of initiatives for Israel's diplomatic position in the broader Middle East. I wonder what your views would be. We'll begin again with Jacques on the implications along those lines that might arise from moving various embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and also Donald Trump's deal of the century sort of remedies, and sort of tangentially related, I'd be interested to know what you both thought about the allegation that Canada's failure to win a seat at the United Nations Security Council was at least partly a function of Canada's alignment with Israel on foreign policy issues in the region. Jacques.
Well, let's start with the issue of the vote in the UN and the positioning of Canada in the UN. I want to start off by saying that I fundamentally disapprove the vote taken last December by Canada. It's departure from the traditional position that Canada has taken, no matter whether it was a liberal or conservative government throughout the years. I want to remind you that in 2006, with the coming into power of Prime Minister Martin, votes in the UN have considerably evolved and changed. And if you ask the Israelis in their perspective on the situation in the UN, or positions in the UN, they will tell you, as President of Israel just said it very lately to Trudeau, very little change. Now, I'm afraid that it is difficult for other countries, and when I say other countries, I mean, I'm not talking about the US or Canada, because we're very much on the same wavelength, along with a few others in terms of the UN. It is difficult to understand that, in fact, the votes in the UN, whether it's at the General Assembly, or whether it's at UNESCO, or whether it's at the World Trade Organization, in all these instances, the hammering of Israel on a systematic basis make each resolution pointless. And these resolutions, at the end of the day, do not matter in terms of substance. They are an initiative to hammer at Israel, and therefore they should be voted against, no matter what the intimate analysis of the substance should be. They should be called for what they are. They are propaganda under the UN. This is not acceptable. Now, it is.
Can I interrupt you, Jacques? I agree with everything you've said.
Well, we are on the same. I know we are on the same wavelength, John. I know we are. some people have tried to divide us, but very wrongfully so, because there is no division among us. Your party and our party, and history is here to prove it, have been adamant at supporting Israel. And if we have lost a seat at the UN because of that, so be it. That's a price to pay for principles. That's a price to pay to support a democracy, which is Israel. That's a price to pay for friendship. You don't have allies and you shoot them in the back because it's becoming convenient to be elected to the position. You hold your grounds on moral values and moral principles, and that's what we have done all along. Your party and my party, both at the helm of Canada.
Well, let me say this, Terry. On the vote of the Security Council, I don't think that Canada's support of Israel was a factor in it. I think that's a bunch of baloney. Frankly, I think in 2010, when we lost it, it was a bunch of baloney. In 2010, we didn't come to the table with a value proposition, and I don't think we ran a good campaign. But I don't think our support of Israel affected that vote. I will say this. It's amazing that a Zionist like myself, I think Canada had amazing relationships with the Sunni Arab world when Stephen Harper and I were in power, and the challenges, the fight we had with Saudi Arabia, the fight we had with China, the fight we had with India, really contributed to our defeat at the UN Security Council. And I don't think we can blame, or anyone should get away with blaming our support of Israel on it. If anything, I give Jacques what Jacques said, and I strongly agree with, is Paul Martin began to change Paul Martin's government, what Jacques was a member of, began to change our position on Israel. I'm a big fan of Prime Minister Chrétien. I don't apologize for that, but Paul Martin did, I think, started to steer the relationship with Israel in a different course. Obviously, he was only very briefly in power, but it would be fair of me to acknowledge that. Stephen Harper relations warmed considerably, but then when I became foreign minister, I changed all of our votes in 2011 to reflect the United States position and our true position. Not that we necessarily all agreed disagreed with all the resolutions, but we, as Jacques said, didn't join in the pylon, which is Jacques got it exactly correct. But I do think that Canada did embarrass itself with changing one of our votes at the UN to try to curry favor with the Islamic world. And we did that letter that Trudeau's appointee as UN ambassador sent out on the eve of the vote was frankly not a proud day for Canada. I don't want to see, I was asked to chair a group, Conservative Friends of Israel. I declined because I want to see the Canadian Conservative Party and the Canadian Liberal Party be pro-Israel parties and it not be a partisan issue. But there was a few, I would call them bumps along the road to the Security Council vote that didn't reflect well on the current government. And I don't want you to call on my Liberal friends, Anthony Heslop, who's a great supporter of Israel, or Jacques, to comment on that. But we all know that those were bumps in the road. My big view is we've got, I think a very well qualified ambassador in Bob Ray that's been appointed. I'm on the board of CEJA. And my recommendation is we should sit down with Bob and talk about not just the issues, but there's the general pylon. And Bob is a reasonable person, and hopefully we can have the community can have an effective dialogue with him, not on the substance of the issues, but just does Canada really need to pile on? And you can vote a certain way, and then give an explanation of your vote following the vote to put it in context, which we did when I changed our votes. I don't support expansion of settlements in the territories. I just refuse to just join the pylon condemning Israel. We have a privileged relationship with the government of Israel. We can take our concerns face to face to the leadership there and probably be more effective than if we just joined a collective pylon. Yeah.
John, I don't know if I may, just one quick word. Are you aware of the initiative I took as Minister for the Francophonie in 2004 and 5 about Israel? There was a summit of the Francophonie in 2004 in Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso. And there was an attempt at, again, using that, like in Durban, to demonize Israel, which is not even a country belonging to the Francophonie, which is a mistake, by the way. It should be, given the 20% or 25% of its French-speaking population. But I took the initiative under Paul Martin's leadership to invite both the Palestinian Authority and Israel to sit together as observers around the tables of the Francophonie, so that for once, instead of looking at each other as enemies, they could together look at problems outside of their own little realm, and maybe that can bring them a bit together. I know it was very modest. Obviously, it was modest.
But everything starts with modesty.
Yeah, and you know what? I got the support of the Secretary General of Francophonie at the time, Abdou Diouf, support from Belgium, from Senegal, from Romania. I was invited by Lebanon and Egypt to discuss this matter, and the whole thing collapsed when our government fell in November 2005. We were supposed to have a cabinet, ministers meeting of the Francophonie. I believe it was in Madagascar, and my ticket was ready, and this item was on the agenda. And we fell just 2 days before my departure.
Well, those type of initiatives, we need more of
those.
We need more of those type of initiatives to try to build support for Israel. J'étais aussi un ancien ministre pour la francophonie de la province de l'Ontario quand j'étais ministre provincial.
Before we leave the issue of kind of a, you know, this is an interesting thing about Canada is that, and it was about 15 years ago, I'm going to say, that there was a kind of a, you know, very distinct Canadian consensus about Israel that emerged, that was evolving and developing, that uniquely involved the NDP under Tom Mulcair. And I'm really kind of sad that Tom wasn't here tonight, because I've always sort of credited him with isolating and kind of forming a cordon sanitaire around certain unseemly elements that seem to have found a home for themselves in left-wing and social democratic parties in Europe and in North America. I think most dramatically in the case of the British Labour Party and the wreckage of Corbynism, that Tom Mulcair seemed to sort of save the NDP from that sort of thing, it seemed to me. And I wanted to sort of give him credit for that. And he also very, very clearly distanced the New Democratic Party from initiatives that are usually presented under in the rubric of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And now that initiative seems to just sort of never dies, you know? I mean, whether it was, you know, you can sort of trace its origins to the Arab League boycotts back in the late 40s, but it seems to be sort of sputtering along. What's your sense of that initiative and where that's gone?
Well, if I could go first, I think we should. If I could go first, I think we should.
Shall I let him, Jacques?
It's okay. It's okay.
Go ahead.
I like this guy.
As a conservative, I shouldn't be too sanctimonious about the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias on the left, because at another time it would have been from the right.
Sure.
There are obviously in the Democratic Party and on the far left, there are significant anti-Semitism issues and significant anti-Israel bias. I couldn't be happier with the performance of the new Labor leader that has replaced Jeremy Corbyn. Sir Keir Starmer is done, I think, is really doing a major effort. Yeah. I give a lot of credit to leaders in the NDP, but the party has not been good. I give a huge amount of credit to Thomas Mulcair. You know what? We changed our policies significantly when I was minister, and Thomas always had my back in the NDP caucus. I didn't get a single question in Parliament when we changed our votes because of Tom. Tom was an inspired leader of the NDP. Very frankly, I think he was the best leader of the opposition since John Diefenbaker, as Mr. Mulroney has said. And you know what, frankly, I'm going to surprise people. Here in Ontario, Andrea Horwath has been very good on the definition of anti-Semitism. There's a private members bill currently before the Ontario legislature, and Andrea Horwath, from my understanding, has been very good and effective on that issue. The challenge is that we have a few friends in the NDP, but not enough. We need to do more there, but we shouldn't be, and we have a few problems in the Liberal Party, but we shouldn't be too smug on the Conservative side, because at another time it would have been the right of center, which would have been the problem, and now it is the left of center. I genuinely want to see us build a consensus. We've got a consensus, I think, in the Conservative Party, and a pretty good consensus in the Liberal Party, but they blinked a few times, so we need to work collectively to get it over. I realize the Conservatives are not going to be in power all the time, and that's why I want to see the Liberals be pro-Israel, so that we're supportive of our friends and allies and our people who share our values and interests.
I want to second what you said concerning Tom Mulcair. And I said it to him, by the way, directly when we had a meeting with CJA in Ottawa. At the time, he was still leader of the NDP. There was just one small item on which I'd like to debate with him, which is the fact that in 2016 or 17, I don't remember exactly the date, there was a motion on the table concerning BDS, and and he voted. He and his party both voted in favor of BDS, which I found extremely surprising. But apart from that, I think that he has done a magnificent job in reining in some of his members. So that's something which I would have liked very much to debate with him. But let's come back to BDS. I don't want to reduce the history of BDS, but I will to come back on the stated objectives of this movement, which is led, by the way, by the Palestinians from the origin in 1945. At the beginning, by the way, it was to frustrate further Jewish developments in Palestine by means of boycott against Zionist products. Conveniently, in 1948, instead of Zionist products, it became Israeli products.
Yeah.
What are the stated objectives of this movement? In writing, in the text. I'm going to read them to you because I don't want to interpret. First one is withdrawal from the occupied territories. Can be a debate on this. Political freedom requires.
I say disputed land.
Well, of course, and we can. I mean, that's a debate. Removal of the separation barrier in the West Bank, but no word on elimination of terrorism, which used to come galore before this West Bank wall was built. Full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. When you have Arab Palestinians who are guaranteed seats in the Knesset, and when you have Arab Palestinians at the leadership position in hospitals or in the Supreme Court, I just don't know what they're referring to. Respecting, and this is really where I get a bit sensitive, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. The Palestinian refugees have been having preferential treatment from the UN from day one. That is the only refugee group, and I'm not diminishing the pain that some people have suffered in this process. But the refugee groups usually are under the UNHCR. Palestinian refugees have an organization of their own, which is UNRWA. The refugees throughout the world fall under a definition of refugee, which is encompassing only a first-generation refugee. In the case of Palestinians, it is a status which goes down from one generation to the other. In other words, grandchildren of refugees are still refugees. At the same time, 850,000 Jews from Arab countries, who most had to flee from the Arab countries because of the creation of Israel, who fulfilled the requirements of the definition of refugee under the UN, have never been recognized as refugees. So when I have a movement, pro-BDS, supporting an organization, not necessarily knowing all this, because of course it's all fine and dandy to say, I want to protect the weak and I want to protect the refugees and so on. I understand that. That's a very generous movement. But at the same time, if you don't know what you're talking about, this is what you're talking about. You're talking about an anti-Semitic movement from day one. I'm going to give you one quick example. On Saint Laurent Street in Montreal, there is a shoe store owned by a Jewish owner. Amir Kadir, who used to be a member of the National Assembly of Quebec, in Quebec Solidaire, organized a manifestation, demonstration to prevent people from having access to this shoe store under the guise of BDS. The guy had nothing to do with Israel. This owner was simply Jewish. The movement demonstration was not anti-Israel. It was anti-Jewish and therefore anti-Semitic. And therefore anything having to do with BDS is suspect from day one and should be rejected from day one.
I wonder if I could, we don't have all that much time left. Whoops, are you there? Whoops, you guys disappeared. Can you hear me?
I'm
Yes,
here.
Oh, very good. We don't have too much time left, but I wanted to ask about if we can sort of gaze into the future just the tiniest bit. You know, there's less than 100 days to go, before the American election. it looks fairly clear that Joe Biden's going to win. I don't know, but let's presume that he will, for the sake of argument here. And he has suggested that he's going to attempt to sort of breathe life back into the JCPOA. We haven't spoken very much about Iran. And I'd like you to sort of address, what you see the major developments being in the region in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the absolute collapse, the humanitarian catastrophe of Syria, which I've always thought to be the most significant sort of byproduct of the JCPOA. The future of the Middle East peace process, if such a thing even really exists anymore, and what Canada's role, generally speaking, or maybe specifically, might be as we sort of look ahead in the coming years.
I think the challenge that Iran poses is significant, huge. I think Trudeau's government was going in the wrong direction under Dion at Foreign Affairs. They have had a major course correction, which frankly I applaud. I'm glad. We broke off relations with Iran when I was minister because, for one simple reason, we couldn't trust that they would come to the aid of our diplomats if there was an incursion into our embassy, and our embassy was not secure. And Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terror. Their human rights record is abysmal and getting worse under Rouhani. And obviously their support of terrorism and the nuclear program make them a rogue state. I have huge respect for John Kerry. He is a gentleman who got up every day and advanced the good cause in the world. I just think he was wrong on this issue. I think Iran only understands one thing, and that's strength. And we need to be tough, and we need to be blunt, and we need to present our case aggressively to them. I think, frankly, Canada enjoyed a popularity and an enthusiasm in the Sunni Arab world because we shared their huge concern about Iran and stood with them. We think we all, as Zionists and pro-Israel advocates, we may only look at Iran through the lens of Israel, which I did for a long time. But when I became foreign minister, imagine if you're the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, just across the Gulf from them, even closer to them than Israel. They're every bit as concerned as Israel is and as we are. And we can make common cause with them and try to seek regime change internally, not military imposed regime change, but hopefully the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow the power of the mullahs and stop their governance in COVID has been the worst in the world. I can't even go on about how the concerns I have with respect to the Iranian regime. This is not a group that respects peace gestures and goodwill. They only understand one thing, and that's strength and toughness. And they're Israel's worst enemy, and they're frankly one of the biggest threats to international peace and security in the world today. And I was worried about the Trudeau government, but they've course corrected quite nicely and been tough on Iran.
It's quite interesting. It's in 1935 that Persia became Iran. And some of you might know, but the etymology of the word Iran is Aryan. And Reza Shah, who was leading Iran at the time, was in line with Hitler. Hitler would take care of the Jews from Europe, and Iran would take care of the Jews from the Middle East. That was a deal. Nothing has changed. You can have some period in time where the movement became a bit more laxist in terms of their anti-Semitism, but it is the same origin, the same country. Now, I think that we cannot talk about Iran without talking also about Turkey. It is not to be dissociated, because in my view, both have a dream of reviving their former empires. Iran has a dream of reviving the Persian Empire, and Turkey has the dream of reviving the Ottoman Empire. Iran is not only a destabilizing force for the Middle East, it is a threat to the entire, not only region, but to the globe. Their decision to arm the Houthis in Yemen, the decision to arm the Hezbollah in Lebanon, their connection to the Hamas, and we don't know whether they're here or not. We don't know whether Qatar is moving back or still supporting. I mean, all the things are shifting and moving. But all these moves are aimed only at one thing, which is destabilization. I'm going to say that disappearance or elimination of Israel is one of the objectives of Iran. It is on the route of their ambitions to reign regionally. Israel is on their way, and they want to eliminate Israel because Israel is a major factor to prevent them from achieving that. And therefore, I understand why, and you're right, John, you're right. That's the reason why the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are so adamant now in getting closer to Israel, because they are the front line against Iran's ambition. By the way, if you allow me just a quick point, do you know that in the United Arab Emirates, I'm, by the way, at the present time, president of the Quebec Sephardic Association, okay? I had the pleasure to send a letter to a gentleman in Dubai, because he has founded the United Jewish Community of the Emirates. And this organization has been set up with the support of the political leaders of the UAE. So this is just a point I wanted to make en passant. I think it's such a beautiful achievement to have these people organize themselves as Jews in an Arab country in which they had no space before, and now they are recognized by the highest authorities of the country. So to come back to Iran.
Jacques, I'm going to interrupt you. I completely agree with everything you've said. The Emiratis are, the government of the United Arab Emirates is not perfect, but in that region, it is pretty bloody good. They're one of the best governed countries in the world. It's not a liberal democracy. It's not perfect, but they're good people.
The last point, thank you, John. The last point I wanted to make is that I'm a bit worried, if not to say very worried, about what's happening in Lebanon. Yeah. We talk about Iran, we talk about Turkey. Lebanon is collapsing completely.
It's collapsing.
An inflation rate which is completely out of this world. The Lebanese pound has just collapsed completely. People are on the street. People are starting to starve. We don't talk about it yet, but it's coming. And this is a country which is under the influence of the Hezbollah. What is it going to lead? How is it going to impact on the Israeli borders to the north of the country? I have no clue. But that's something we should be watching very, very carefully. It is not something happening far abroad. It is happening at the border of Israel.
Well, very good.
If I could, Terry, could I say one thing? One thing I want to say before we run out of time is one of the biggest challenges we face as pro-Israel advocates is the bias in the media. And Honest Reporting does a phenomenal job at calling it. I mean, there'll be a headline, you know, Israel kills 3 Palestinians in shootout, and then you find out that like one of the people they killed was stabbing a pregnant woman. They do a phenomenal job at calling out, particularly in the CBC, anti-Israel bias, and does a phenomenal job. And to all of those who are on this webinar, who are supporters and activists with Honest Reporting, good on you. You do a great job.
Yeah, well, as a journalist, I'd also like to say the same. And you know, I haven't been very harshly criticized by Zionists for what I've written about Israel. As a journalist, I made a number of trips there, and I've written a lot about the region. I will close this with a criticism of Israel, though. There isn't a decent Irish pub between the Dublin off Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem and Molly Bloom's in Tel Aviv. It's just a wasteland of thirst and deprivation. So I expect I'll get a letter from Honest Reporting Canada. But thanks to...
but I do have a great falafel. I do have a great falafel place in Jerusalem that I can tell you about.
Doesn't make up for it, John. Doesn't make up. Okay, look, it was wonderful talking to you both, and I think this has been really illuminating for everybody who participated and everybody who listened. Thanks again, Honest Reporting Canada, and and bless you all.
Thank you indeed. And I didn't have a chance to thank you, but I want to thank you very wholeheartedly. You're doing well, you're doing very well, and we need you, and I appreciate very much, and I'm so much honored to have been invited to attend your function.
Very good.